Okay, so let's do the start this lecture with the discussion. So I posted on Moodle a movie called Cyberbullying. It's relatively old. It's 8 or 9 years old, and it's an ABC family film, which pretty much tells you it's pretty much a very mild movie when it comes to the facts of cyberbullying. But I certainly want your questions and comments, because we're going to contrast that film with what we're going to see tonight regarding Rehtaeh Parsons and Amanda Todd. Shivani, your hand's up.
Oh yes, about the video, I just wanted to say that it was really sad to know that her friend was behind all of the cyberbullying. And it's really sad to know that the closest person to you can hurt you sometimes. And it was really good to know that they found a mutual ground where they could resolve their problem and implement laws to protect persons who are being cyberbullied.
Yeah, well, yes, exactly. And I was surprised to find it was the girlfriend that did that, but I guess that happens. And the way they wrapped it up at the end, honestly, from my perspective, I thought that was a very family-oriented way to do it. I don't think, to a great degree, and my wife and I watched together, and we had our kids are in their 30s now, so when they were teenagers, this wasn't that much of an issue. But the way they wrapped it up at the end, and everybody was happy, and it was a happy ending, I find that somewhat unrealistic. From what I read and what I've certainly seen in the last 10 years with respect to, again, actual cases where this happened. Kate, your hand's up.
Hello.
Hi, Kate.
Hi. I just found it interesting that it took them going to the media to get real change, and it didn't happen they went to other agents, the government, to try and get a bill, and it wasn't until the media was involved and they're like, oh no, they misunderstood. So
yeah, and that's a good point, because that was actually pretty realistic when it comes to this kind of thing. You'll find that, and this is I was an American film, but the same thing applies in Canada, is that it takes a tragedy, for the most part, and all the mass media, the public attention that's given to that kind of thing before real change takes place. And real change being politicians basically, getting motivated to enact laws that address whatever tragedies taken place. So that was actually fairly true to form. Valerie?
I was actually I watched it with my daughter. She's 12 years old. And last year she had an incident with a bully who had taken a picture of her changing and sent it to a bunch of her friends through Snapchat. So we had already kind of dealt with something similar to this, and we talked about, how she could approach, me or a teacher, whoever she felt comfortable with, to discuss it. And it's just nice that they kind of included ways to cope with cyberbullying in the movie as well. And it's a good conversation starter if you have children or children in your life, brothers, sisters, whatever, in order to kind of start that conversation.
Oh, good. I'm really glad to hear that. So that it helped in a real world kind of way. So that's thank you. That's really good to hear. I'm pleased. Madison, you had your hand up. Hands down. Michelle? Oh, Madison's back. Okay, Madison, go first.
Sorry. So I'd seen the movie when I was a kid, in elementary school, I believe it was.
Okay.
So I understand at the time, I don't know if it's still like that in the schools, because I didn't really have a lot of issues with that in high school. But in elementary school, the school system, they don't do much, and they will not help really with cyberbullying, even though it's within a school environment and people can be doing it in school, and it's the people through school. At the time, at least, they wouldn't do anything with it because they were it's not school property. They're doing this over the web, and there were a lot of issues with that, because at the time, cyberbullying in elementary school for me, it wasn't me, but I knew a lot of people who were in the process of being bullied because it was all anonymous and there were so many sites you can use. So I don't know if it was changed or not, but the cyberbullying, it really did not have any effect on the school. Like the school wouldn't look into it. They wouldn't help with it at all. You always had to go to outside sources.
I'm not going to ask how long ago that was, but I mean, do you think that's still the case in elementary school? I mean, it's.
Well, I mean, I've only been out of high school for 2 years. So like this was back in 2013, 2014. So it was kind of long ago, but not that long ago because it's when I was.
That's unfortunate. I'm not happy to hear that. Right? It's such a pervasive issue these days, and it affects, so many, young people. I mean, people, kids who are actually, 10, 11, 12 years old, who are, and it drives me nuts because I have granddaughters that are teenagers, and so many things are sexualized.
Yeah.
And when I see that in a 9 and 10-year-old granddaughter, things that when my children were that age or I was that age, that it wouldn't even cross my mind that is something that would be a topic of conversation, or that they'd even have any cognizance about that. It's disturbing. It really is, and I'm sure it's not that so much of a surprise for you guys. You were certainly younger a lot more recently than I have been, but it's amazing. It really is amazing. I mean, and it's the media too. You can't stop kids from watching TV where they're not going to be exposed to a great deal of sexualization of events, right? It's absolutely, it's in their face. You could as a parent, you couldn't censor it to a great degree unless you sent them to bed at 4:00 in the afternoon, right? So it's out there. Okay, now Michelle, you had your hand up.
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yeah, sure.
Hi everyone. My question was actually geared to Val and what she was saying about her daughter in school. I thought that taking pictures of people and posting them online was illegal. I didn't know that you could do that, and especially in school. So I just was wondering with Val, what happened? What was the outcome of her daughter in school?
Well, I kind of posted something there. This had happened on a Friday. She approached a teacher to tell them, and I didn't receive any phone call from the school. So Mama lost her bananas on Monday. But I went to the police station when I dropped her off at her father's after talking to her. I took a moment and sat down and talked to her about, what happened, how she was feeling. And then I went to the police station. The police got involved because it was another child and there wasn't proof because it was sent through Snapchat and they disappear.
Yeah.
And the age of the child, because she was under the age of 12, the police didn't do much, but they did involve CAS. Due to the nature of what happened, they actually involved CAS because they were concerned about what was happening at home as well.
Yeah.
This was considered okay in the child's mind, whether it be bullying or sexual child pornography, whatever, right? Yeah. Whatever was going through the child's brain was not at a good place. But the school offered free counseling to her. It didn't happen on school grounds. It was actually outside of the grounds. And the teachers have kept them apart. So there's like a 7-8 or a 6-7 class, and they'll keep them in separate classes.
That's good. That's weird.
Like, that's all they can really do at the school, which kind of answers Madison's as well.
Yeah.
So you'll need outside sources.
Yeah.
Thanks, Michelle. Val. Aishat, your hand's up.
Hello.
Hi.
What I want to say is kind of similar to what Madison already said. Like, it's just surprising to find out that there's really nothing school can do about it, or like there's no, for example, in state, there's no law that is against it. Like, it's really sad. So like my question is like, is there any law against it right now, or there's none still?
We're going to talk about that tonight in the class, what's been done regarding laws. So just hang on and we'll get to that.
All right.
Sure. Shivani, your hand's still up. Is it another question?
Oh, yes. In the movie though, they raise an important point that children, when they're undergoing cyberbullying, they should talk up, because as a young person, concealing all of that by yourself, it can cause a lot of constraint on you, that mental illnesses and all of that, like mental depression, so it is important that they talk to someone when they're undergoing cyberbullying, because it can lead to suicidal thoughts, etc. So I think that is a very important point that they raise in the movie.
Yeah, absolutely. And again, we're going to talk some more about this. I'm going to show you a very short news clip as part of the lecture on Rehtaeh Parsons from Nova Scotia. And then we're actually going to watch a documentary on Amanda Todd. These are both Canadian girls who killed themselves as a function of cyberbullying, and actually both those instances, basically resulted in changes to the law. So we'll talk about that some more. Anybody have any other questions or comments about the movie? I'm glad you guys were much more receptive to it than I thought. Because it's not a in your face, stark kind of thing. It was done in a family friendly kind of way. So good for you. That's nice to see, because I didn't want to have the whole class be in your face about it. I wanted to have something at the beginning of it that actually had kind of a positive spin to it. And it really, and again, I don't think in reality, a lot of these kind of instances that go so far whereas Taylor in the movie, basically attempted to kill herself. I don't think there's a lot of situations where at the end of that particular kind of circumstance, it's a happy ending where she forgives the girlfriend who posted herself posted online as a different person and caused these kind of things. I think that's a relatively unusual, restorative justice almost way for this to end. And I don't think a lot of these cases end quite so nicely, but I wanted you to see that, and we'll compare it to what we're going to see later in the class. Lexine, you have your hand up?
Yeah, definitely. I think it was quite alarming to say that it's quite important that when persons are being bullied online or wherever, that they should not react by being a bully also, because the young lady, she was making some B comments and stuff that's online. So it's important to know that even if you're being bullied, you should be the bigger person, get help or whatever, but don't react by being a bully.
Excellent point. But again, put yourselves in the mindset of, younger teenagers who are going through this, right? That kind of response, would be a pretty natural way to approach it, right? Because it's so visceral. But it was again good to see in the movie itself. Anybody else? All right. Oh, yep, that's it. Okay. Thanks, guys. I appreciate it. Good commentary on the movie. I appreciate it. Everybody took the time to actually watch it, so that's appreciated. So we're going to go to the PowerPoint, right? And let's take it from here, okay? So, as the chapter is called, Cyberbullying, a Modern Day Scourge of the Internet, and it obviously truly is. We know that it causes direct harm, basically mostly psychological, but can really, obviously lead to physical harm as well. So it's an incredibly dangerous phenomenon. For the purposes of police who are asked to intervene in it, they have to be trained to recognize the symptoms and how to deal with it. So again, we talked about last class about how most police services that aren't larger ones won't have a cybercrime kind of unit, but this kind of thing, which happens so often amongst young people, you don't have to have a specialized unit for it. Most officers would be trained in how to address this. So it's not an issue of how large a police service it is, right? And again, the harm that's caused and how to mitigate it really depends on how you respond to it and who you call for support. And clearly it's important to, in fact, to reach out for support. So how common is cyberbullying itself? Well, the internet has grown from 600 million users to over 3 billion. And even that, I think, is a conservative estimate. 3 billion is less than half the population on the planet. And I would tend to think that more than half now has some access to internet, unless you're in places in Africa and Asia that perhaps, and even northern Canada, I guess, where the internet just isn't available. But if it is available, you're going to find pretty much everybody is using it, right? The study that is in your text in chapter 3 says that 100% of youth, that's persons who are 15 to 29 years of age, have the internet. So that's everybody, right? And in an advanced country like Canada and the United States and the UK and what have you, that's pretty much going to be the same everywhere you go. As a function of that, of course, it's a struggle for law enforcement to keep on top of this, right? The numbers are exponential. So, you know, it really is a fair amount of dedicated personnel to look after it. 25 to 35% of youth have been victims of cyberbullying. And I thought about that when I was reading that stat. I mean, we have 24 people in this class, 24 students in the class. So that tells me that anywhere between 6 and 8 of you guys, right, have been victims of cyberbullying. I'm not saying that any one of you have individually been a victim, but statistically, a third of you have been, right? Because you're the age group, you know, that for the most part falls within that 15 to 29-year-old, you know, span of time. So that really caught me by unawares, because, you know, when I teach this stuff and all the other courses I teach, you know, which aren't necessarily this directly related to people's experiences, you know, for the most part, I teach law and justice, and it's, for, you know, to a great degree theoretical, right? I teach criminal justice. None of you have been in, you know, none of my students have been in jail, so I tell them, you know, what that's involved, or been charged with crimes and what have you. So you listen to me, and and my students, you know, for the 7 years I've been here, listen to me, take it down, hopefully, you know, absorb it and learn from it. But this is a topic, right, that actually affects you as students, right? And that kind of really gets to me, because, you know, that's so unusual for me to have something that could be, you know, incredibly personal to those of you who I'm teaching. So anyway, I'm not asking anybody to basically say this has happened to them, but statistically, it likely has. All right, so I understand that. Cyberbullying to a great degree involves texts and pictures shared beyond the intended recipient, which means, of course, that there's a lack of consent, right, related to that. So, you know, something is shared with somebody who is never intended to be shared with. We'll talk about that more when we talk about things like sexting. So the effects of cyberbullying, obviously, emotional, physical, behavioral, self-blame. We saw some of that in the movie, you know, regarding cyberbullying, in that, you know, once you're online and you're participating in whatever it is that leads to it, you know, once you become a victim of it, you start to think to yourself, did I cause this? Right? Did I start the interaction, or respond to some kind of an email or whatever it was that, you know, put this all in motion, right? And so, you know, feelings of self-blame would be a very normal kind of thing. Obviously, you know, people, you know, you get desperate about it, and again, we'll see this a lot in the case studies we have tonight. So, attempted suicide and suicidal thoughts, you know, are very realistic, because what happens, of course, is that, you know, for a lot of young people, the internet is their world, right? There's very little time during the day when you're actually not looking at a screen of some sort, right? All of you have phones, right? I dare say that there probably isn't an hour in a day that you don't at some point look at your phone. I look at my phone that often, and, you know, I've only been using phones, you know, a third of my lifetime, as opposed to you guys who've had them your entire lifetime. So, you know, I look at it all the time, and I'm sure you all do too. And then what happens, of course, is that when you see something like this take place, where there's images of you, or things are being said about you that are on the internet and being widely dispersed amongst people you know, that becomes your whole world. Right? That becomes your entire reality, is, you know, this now image of yourself, this reforms you into the person that you think is being exploited on the internet, right? So it's no wonder people have suicidal thoughts, because it gets to the point where it becomes unbearable. You just don't, and especially for younger people who, you know, and you're more mature than a lot of younger people now, but I mean, you know, it's hard for youngsters, you know, young teenagers, to think of themselves in terms of long term. You tend to think of your world as being what's around you now and what's around the corner next week, or maybe 2 or 3 weeks from now. You don't think of yourself in terms of, you know, when I'm 25 or 35, this will be history, right? This won't be part of my life anymore. That's not the kind of thoughts you have when you're that young. You think of, you know, you don't think that far ahead. It's really hard for you to put it behind you. So yeah, you know, suicide becomes the way out, because you really don't see a future in the life that you currently have, the way it's been exploited online. So It's totally understandable why that happens. Higher risk groups are the most affected by cyberbullying. So again, youth, 15 to 29, but I would think it's more like 12 to 20 is probably more susceptible to this kind of thing. Females, so girls and women, are twice as likely to be exposed to cyberbullying as are men, or male, basically. And the LGBTQ2 plus community, right, are also vulnerable. And we saw that in the movie today, or yesterday and today. So, clearly we had a young woman and we had someone who was gay, who were basically being bullied and were in the center of the movie to some degree. So that's, the movie just epitomizes what we already know is actually true. Interesting enough, and you guys would appreciate this as well, that the majority of interactions are between people who know each other. Right, and that's exactly what the movie was all about. And that's really what happens, right? You chat rooms, or instant messaging, or it starts as an email and turns into a series of correspondence, or on a website and social media, right? All those kind of things. These tend to be people that you know to a great degree, and that's what makes it so painful. Because again, when you see yourself as being abused and the victim of cyberbullying, it's because the real effect of it is because you now think that people that you know think of you in that way, right? And that just kind of makes sense. So why would you care what a stranger thinks? But as we're going to see in the Amanda Todd case in a few minutes, it did involve bullying by somebody who essentially was a stranger, who ingratiated himself into her life, who obviously became not a stranger when he put her over the edge, but it was a stranger who participated in this. Whereas for the most part, you don't have to look that far afield. It's going to be somebody who is in your circle of acquaintances, to say the least. All right. So defining cyberbullying in Canada, it's broadly defined as the deliberate, willful, and repeated harm caused to another person online, which is pretty much everything we've just described. Right. So there's legislation in most provinces, and Chapter 3 sets out the provinces that currently have legislation dealing with cyberbullying. But remember, and this is really important to remember, is from a constitutional point of view, things that provinces can put in place by way of statutes and regulations are based upon what they are allowed to constitutionally under Section 92 of the Constitution Act of 1867, which was formerly the British North America Act. Section 92 says, here's the authority that provinces have over issues. And then Section 91 says, here are the things like that the federal government can do. So, and I'll get to that in a second. So for the provincial areas of jurisdiction, it has things that tend to be kind of a more local nature, things like culture and language, and things that are more within the boundaries of a provincial boundary. That's what it is. Interesting enough, I mean, obviously, when the original Constitution for Canada, the British North America Act, was put in place in 1867, there was no internet, right? So, we have to look at, so which jurisdiction has power over internet, provinces or the feds? And as it turns out, internet it falls within the category basically of local, considered to be local dissemination of information, which makes it provincial. So that's why we have provincial legislation, but it doesn't deal with punishment, right? Because that's federal, and I'll talk about that in a second. So all the provincial legislation can do is put into place things, for instance, that allow people to be sued. That's a civil matter, that's provincial. For damages, we'll talk about that in a few minutes. Things that could be put in place by regulations that schools have to follow to protect students, this kind of thing, right? So things that aren't criminal, but things that do have some impact on how to address it in, for the most part, a rehabilitative kind of nature, all right? That's provincial. Federally, it's a whole different ballgame. So federally does have the exclusive jurisdiction over the criminal law. So that's why we're looking at basically when you have in 2014, Protecting Canadians from Online Crime Act. This was a direct result of the death of Rehtaeh Parsons the previous year. So, this is important to remember. So again, it's like we talked about earlier in the discussion, it takes big events, large tragedies, a lot of publicity for politicians to often, make change. and this was the result of it in Canada, was when Rehtaeh Parsons killed herself. We eventually got this. This particular act was in fact an amendment to the Criminal Code, right? And the Criminal Code of Canada is again federal, Section 91 of the Constitution. So, you know, it doesn't matter where you live in Canada, everybody has the same criminal code, whether it's, you know, British Columbia or Newfoundland and Labrador, and including Quebec. Quebec has a different law provincially for civil matters, for things like lawsuits and damages. They have the Civil Code of Quebec, whereas everybody else in Canada has the common law, which we adopted from England at the time of Confederation. So, you know, but the common law is for all the provinces except Quebec, but the criminal law is the same, including Quebec. So it doesn't matter where you are, we have the same criminal law. Interestingly enough, the United States is the converse of this. So in the United States, they actually have 50 separate criminal codes dealing with criminal law in each state. All right, and that's why, you know, when you talk about this kind of issue, it's much easier in Canada to legislate something that's going to punish people for things like cyberbullying and revenge porn and all the things we're going to talk about tonight. It's much easier to do it in Canada than it is in the US, because in the US it's done on a state-by-state basis. That's why we saw in the movie when the Taylor's mother went to talk to her senator about putting this in place, she made a reference to, look, other states have done this. You know, why won't you do it? And he fluffed her off basically until the end of the movie, because, you know, you could have a criminal charge available for this kind of thing in Massachusetts, but it wouldn't be available in Rhode Island. That kind of thing. All right, so that's just an interesting thing to keep in mind. So it's a whole, you know, it's a whole different kind of process. But anyway, having said that, so we now do have legislation in most provinces provincially that deals with trying to rehabilitate and protect people from from cyberbullying and the damages it causes. And we also have, and I can tell you that, for instance, in your textbook at page 54, right, the criminal code offenses that deal with cyberbullying, and I'll just go through them because it's a useful list. These are criminal charges that have criminal punishments attached to them. So we have counseling suicide, criminal harassment, exploitation, extortion, harassing communications, identity fraud, indecent telephone calls, intimidation, libel, that's criminal libel as opposed to civil, and we'll talk about that in a second, criminal mischief, spreading false news, unauthorized use of a computer, or uttering threats. All of those are very specific sections in Canada's criminal code. All right, so these are all the result of, naturally over the course of time of, things that have come to the attention of politicians in Ottawa. So those are the federal members of parliament. We have 338 of them across the country. That's what's been done at the federal level. Okay. Revenge porn law. We now have a law that allows people to sue with respect to those who share intimate photos. So here's a brief video on the law in that regard.
Newfoundland and Labrador is promising new legislation targeting people who share explicit photos of other people. It will allow victims to sue for damages or get a court order forcing the images to be removed. Peter Cowan joins us now from St. John's. Peter, thanks for joining us. Already a crime to share someone's photos without their consent, but what will this new law in Newfoundland and Labrador do?
Well, John, this is really a case of legislatures here at the House of Assembly keeping up with technology and the way people use it. Because, as you said, it is a criminal offense to share intimate photos that someone has sent you. But that process can be cumbersome for victims to go through that court proceedings. And at the end, the person can end up in jail. But that's not often what people are looking for as remedy. So one of the things they'll be able to do is go to a judge and say, I want a court order that forces that person to take the images offline, to destroy them. And so that's often one of the main things people are looking for. The other thing it allows is compensation. So the victim can actually get a judge to say, we're going to order that the person who put these images, that did this damage to you, actually has to pay for what they've done in this case. And this isn't the first province to do it. Alberta has a similar law, but the Justice Minister here in Newfoundland and Labrador says it really is time that these laws keep up with technology.
And you only have to hear one story of someone who had an image like this used against them. It's horrible. It's not just humiliating. It's not just embarrassing. It's devastating. You know, people have chosen to take their lives because of the repercussions of this. I mean, that says everything.
Stories involving sextings, of course, have made headlines right across the country. Peter, but remind us again how significant an issue sexting is in today's world.
Yeah, John, this is one of those things where there is a divide between the generations on this. A lot of older people are going, well, why would you even send intimate images when you know that they could be forwarded on, they could be posted? For a lot of young people, though, this is sort of the new part of dating. It's the next step after you send a few flirty texts to maybe send a few racy images to go along. And in fact, a survey earlier this year found for young people, 4 out of 10 had sent an intimate image of themselves. Now, the interesting part of that is, of the people who'd sent intimate photos, 40% of them had had those images shared with other people. So the Justice Minister is saying part of this does need to be education to let people know, first of all, the repercussions of what can happen if you send images like this, but also tell people why it's important that these images not be shared. Sometimes it is malicious intent, what's called revenge porn, when someone is trying to get back at an ex, for example, but other times it's just a case of someone wanting to share something with their friends after they receive them. And so the Justice Minister is promising not just legislation here at the House of Assembly, but also an education campaign to let people know about the repercussions and try and prevent this from happening.
Thank you, Peter. Peter Cowan in St. John's.
All right, guys. Okay, so the next thing we're going to talk about, and I want to do this for discussion purposes, is we're going to watch a couple of more videos. One's going to be a long one. It's the documentary on Amanda Todd. So we're going to talk about Rehtaeh Parsons and Todd, right? And so, you know, basically, I gave you a article. It's a Wikipedia kind of thing on Rehtaeh Parsons. So I've given you some facts backing that up. And so we're just going to watch this news piece on it, and then I'd like to talk to you a little bit about Rehtaeh Parsons. Let's do this.
At Sackville High School, there's a girls' empowerment club, Girl on Fire. They're not afraid to talk about heavy stuff.
Yeah. You don't think it's talked about enough?
Yeah. Sexual consent, self-worth, depression. Those issues dogged Rehtaeh Parsons.
Breaks my heart that it wasn't talked about as much as it should have been. I think maybe like the Rehtaeh story was talked about with adults, but who it really needs to be focused on is like teens, like people our age. Like that's who it happened to, a girl that was 15.
I remember seeing it on the news actually, and then as a 10-year-old, you know, like you don't really think about that kind of stuff until it happens.
Their worldview, their lives have been changed by Rehtaeh.
A lot more people are aware of like consent and that it wasn't her fault at all, because teenagers stuff happens and doesn't mean that they have right to do that to her at all.
Guiding the group is a teacher, Megan Lemoyne. She herself was sexually assaulted, but she doesn't see herself as a victim.
For me, talking about it does take the power away, and it does help me.
She's walking the talk.
I hope that instead of like this seeming like a super downer, that it's more of a like rage fire that makes you want to go out there in the world and, you know, stand up for yourself and be a positive role model for other girls.
In the aftermath of that photo, lawyer David Fraser successfully challenged Nova Scotia's first cyberbullying law, which had been rushed through months after Rehtaeh died. A court deemed it was unconstitutional. A new law was passed, but not enacted. Fraser gave the government recommendations on regulations, and he hopes they get it right this time. But even after all the talk about how to stop cyber abuse, he says that misses the heart of her story.
Consent, young people, alcohol consumption, intoxication, all these other sorts of things that really was at the core of the beginning of what happened.
Jacob Wells went to high school with Rehtaeh. The date she died is tattooed to his wrist, her mark on his life.
I've gone to parties with a specific intent to just get laid.
He didn't really know her. She was a few years younger than him, and he didn't think much about all the rumors and gossip about her. But his younger sister was a friend of hers who opened his eyes, and he reached his own reckoning, an ugly truth.
It really upset me to realize, you know, this young girl is no longer here. Her family is forever ruined. I too could have caused something like that to happen. I too could have ruined a young girl's life. I too could have ruined, you know, an entire family's life.
Wells is a construction worker who journals about topics like consent. It helps him to cope with depression. But he struggles with how to talk to his buddies at the job site over how they talk about and ogle women.
Most men, you know, you see a girl walking up the sidewalk, oh, it's just ridiculous.
Ritea's friends are now young women, but she's not forgotten. As a teen, Bryony Jollymore was threatened by a bully to stop talking about her friend. But she won't stop. She's even given her daughter a middle name, Ritea. But some things never change.
When I did this, I actually had some people that thought it was wrong to name her after her, and were kind of more like, wow, well, why would you name your daughter after some girl that killed herself or something?
Her answer? Ritea was kind and caring. She'll share with her daughter the sadness too, and vows to help kids in distress in Ritea's memory.
The girl who changed all the rules. Changed how we viewed things. She, her story almost kind of, I find, rewrote what we think about mental health and suicide awareness. So.
And she went to a party with a friend.
The conversation that's opened up about sexual consent, mental health, empowerment is the legacy that endures. Just ask Madison Sasko, one of the youngest members of Girl on Fire. She's 15.
You know, we should just honor her by spreading her story and like not, you know, just hiding it away because it's something really important.
She was 15.
Elizabeth Chu, CBC News, Lower Sackville.
Okay, so that didn't give you the facts, but I did give you the facts. That's why I posted them on Moodle. So does anybody just want to recite for the class what the facts were in Ritea Parsons' case? Okay, I'll give them to you, and then we'll talk about it some more after we watch the documentary on Amanda Todd. So Ritea Parsons was 15. She went to a party, right? She was drinking. Everybody was drinking. Things got out of hand. She was raped by 4 guys, and during 2 of those assaults, she was puking. She was throwing up, right? And it was filmed, right? And then the film was distributed. And and again, the same kind of thing. It's widely distributed, lots of comments on it, and it came back to her. Obviously, destroyed her, her self-image and her self-well-being, and she, as a function of all that, she hanged herself. And the hanging didn't kill her, but it put her into a coma, and her parents had to take her off life support. So it did in fact kill her. So a really, really tragic case of cyberbullying. So, the next case, next we're going to talk about is Amanda Todd, right? So let me just see if I can, there we go, make this a little bit bigger. All right, so we're going to watch this, and then let's have a decent conversation about what this shows us.
At SAC.
Okay, so I open this up to the class. Does anybody have any comments or points to be made regarding this particular case? Anything you found interesting or disturbing? Nobody? Okay, all right, let's move on then. Okay, so here's the advice that police should give to victims of cyberbullying. So don't retaliate, and we talked about this earlier, so it's not a good idea to basically write back to them and say whatever nasty things you're gonna say back. We saw that in the movie. Obviously, block or end contact with whoever is doing the bullying. Contact the police, and if the crime has been witnessed or somebody's safety is at risk, then certainly you want the police involved. Again, document everything, and again, we saw that in the movie, and file a record of the abuse with the internet service provider. So whoever is hosting the Facebook perhaps, or Gmail, or whoever is providing the service, then that's who you should be contacting to say, look, this is taking place. Please investigate it. And in the Amanda Todd case, a lot of points go to Facebook. In that particular case, it was their investigation that really prompted the Canadian police to do something, right? So, you know, they were much more proactive in this case than were the RCMP. So lots of kudos to Facebook. All right. Going back a bit, the difference between criminal law and civil law when it comes to these kind of things, right? So obviously, if somebody has broken a law, particularly a law in the criminal code, and I gave you that list of those that are set out in the chapter, then those are criminal offenses, and as a function of that, will be subject to criminal law enforcement. All right, but to keep in mind, you know, a criminal case is not an easy thing, and it's not an easy thing to prosecute. The onus is on the Crown to prove that somebody has committed a crime beyond a reasonable doubt, right? And the person who is alleged to have committed the crime, the Crown has to prove both actus reus and mens rea. Anybody want to give us the definitions of either of those? What's mens rea? Anybody?
Hi, sir. Yeah, mens rea is the mental act, and actus rea is the actual act of the crime.
Yeah, thanks,
Doing
Joe.
that.
Exactly right. Okay, that's what it is. So there you go. So you have, the Crown has to prove not only that the person, the actus reus, the person actually did what is alleged to have taken place, the actual bullying, and more importantly, they have to prove that they had the criminal intent, the mental element, to commit the crime and cause the damage that they did. All right, and beyond a reasonable doubt, which means, you know, almost to a certainty. So that's a fairly high threshold to meet. And likewise, you know, accused have the benefit of the charter for the defense. And I gave you in last class those provisions of the charter, section 7 to 15, which are the due diligence provisions. And so, you know, and we saw that a bit in the movie as well, where they talked to police, or they talked to the Lindsay, her father, who was the lawyer at the door, said that she had the constitutional First Amendment right, as obviously American, to freedom of expression, right? Well, that's a charter right as well. So there you go. So it's not necessarily that easy a thing to prove, but if you document it appropriately and you keep records and what have you, the case obviously would be much easier to meet. The other thing we have, of course, is the prospect to sue for damages. That's in a civil case. The examples given in the text are things like slander and libel, so that's defamation. And clearly the things, for instance, that happened to Taylor in the movie were defamatory. She didn't do any of those things that allegedly she was said to have. So for instance, if you say that somebody has given you an STD, right, that's incredibly defamatory. So the difference between libel and slander is this. Slander is something that is said, but not put down into print or some other medium where it's recorded. Libel is where, in fact, something is said online that's recordable. So if it's on a webcam, that's libel, or if it's in an email, that's libel because it's written and it's easy to look at. So libel is the much more serious case of defamation because it is a permanent record that can be looked at almost by anybody and therefore causes that much more extensive damage. So the chances of you, in fact, suing and collecting damages is going to be much greater for something that's libelous rather than slanderous. The kinds of damages that there are in civil cases are broken down into what are called special, general, and punitive. Punitive are also called exemplary. Special damages are out of pocket expenses. All right, these are things that could be counted, that is money out of your pocket. So say, for instance, that somebody was bullied and they became depressed and had to have therapy and go on medication and all kinds of things that weren't necessarily covered by, our health services. So, the cost of therapy, the $45, $50, $60 every hour that it would cost, do to basically provide, assistance to somebody who suffered from depression or what have you, that's out of pocket. That's something you can count. So that's the kind of thing you have in special damages. Or if somebody, was of an age where they were working, perhaps they finished school, it doesn't always have to be teenagers, and they can no longer work. So they're lost wages. Those are things that are called special damages. General damages are a much broader category for things for pain and suffering, right? So this is where you tend to get awards of damages that are larger than special damages. These are things, the kind of pain and humiliation that would cause somebody to consider suicide. That's something that would be assessed as a significant amount of money. All right, that's a significant harm to somebody, right? So that's a general damage kind of thing. It's the equivalent of this kind of thing in a car accident, for instance, is pain and suffering when you're hurt dramatically in a crash, and you're in lots of pain, right? That will cause general damages in the hundreds of thousands of dollars. Well, that's the comparative for general damages for this kind of thing. And punitive damages is basically where somebody's activities are so egregious or heinous that has an element of punishment. So the judge not only wants to grant somebody special damages for money out of their pocket, wants to give them general damage for pain and suffering, but they also want to punish the person who has caused the harm, right? So punitive damages are relatively common type of damages in a civil lawsuit regarding cyberbullying because of the nature of the harm, right? That just kind of makes sense. Okay. Sexting and its role, and we've touched upon this very briefly. So sexting is what you all know, and it is essentially the transmission of sexually explicit words or videos or photos or what have you. It doesn't have to necessarily be on your phone. It could be on another kind of device. Often it's on a phone because that's the way most texting takes place, and sexting is just an element of that. All right, and then you have what's called sextortion, which is an incredibly fast-growing kind of crime where, in fact, there's an extortion element to somebody who has been involved in sexting, right? So, not unlike cyberbullying, but very much related to the sexting environment. How do police officers respond to, sexting and sextortion, right? So they assess the risk to the victim, what correspondence, texting, sexting has gone on, what's the exposure of risk for that to cause harm, blackmail, those kind of things. The cops should be developing a response plan to ensure that, in fact, that harm doesn't take place. Right? Sometimes there's involved specialized units. We've talked about this before, whether the municipality is large enough to have a cybercrime unit, right? But their job is to, as this is all police officers, is to gather evidence, right, to be entered into court for the purposes of a charge of this nature. Okay, and this is an American video, but it's a good one with respect to the growing awareness around sextortion.
It's been called a new form of sexual assault, online sextortion. What's driving this insidious and growing threat? Tonight we hear from the victims, young, vulnerable, and exposed. Here's ABC's Lindsay Davis.
With the click of a mouse, the beauty queen's moment to shine turned into her darkest days.
I was halfway through my reign as Miss California when I found out that I had a stalker.
But this wasn't just any stalker. Cassidy Wolf, 2013's Miss Teen USA, says it was someone who had an arsenal of private, personal images of her.
I got an anonymous email from someone, and basically it was stating 3 things. If I didn't do what he said, he was going to release all the photos that he had of me.
Wolf was a victim of an online crime the Department of Justice says is a growing concern. It's called sextortion, threatening to release sexually explicit images of people in exchange for money or more sexual content. In Wolf's case, she says she was shocked to learn the pictures even existed.
Had no idea what he was talking about because I'd never taken photos before, so I had no clue.
It turns out a hacker had taken over the webcam on her computer and secretly recorded her for a year, watching her get ready for school in the morning and undressed at night.
He gave me 3 options. The first option was to send him better quality photos. The second option was to Snapchat him, and the third option was to Skype him for 5 minutes and do whatever he said. And if I didn't do any of that, then he would continuously blackmail me, which he did do consistently every single day. I would receive 30 emails a day of him just harassing me, asking for more.
Cassidy's online manipulation lasted for several months until finally her cyber-peeping Tom, Jared James Abrahams, turned himself into the FBI and was sentenced to 18 months in prison. And the biggest surprise for Wolf, it was someone she knew.
The whole entire time that I was receiving emails from this guy, I pictured some creepy guy living in a basement halfway across the world. But then I came to find out that it was someone that I went to high school with, that lived in my hometown.
But in many sextortion cases, the blackmailer is anonymous, as students at George Mason University discovered this week.
So to hear that there were not one but two more cases was really disturbing.
An email from university officials sounded the alarm that unknown suspects gained the trust of two students over the internet, enticing them to broadcast sexual acts over their webcams. Once they did, the suspects recorded those videos and later threatened to post them on the internet if they didn't pay $5,000.
This is calculated, cold-hearted, malicious sadism.
It's something the Department of Justice says is becoming all too common, calling it a significant and global threat, especially when it comes to children. In fact, the vast majority of sextortion victims are female and minors.
Why do the victims fall for this? Victims are in their young teens. They're experimenting. Suddenly there's this person who's giving you all this wonderful validation, and that's the perfect storm for an offender to take advantage.
In one particularly heinous case, a 26-year-old man named Lucas Michael Chancellor terrorized more than 350 young girls on social media and chat sites.
None of us in Jacksonville, including task force officers and fellow agents who've been working these types of violations for years, we had never seen anything like this before. Chancellor
entered online chat rooms popular with girls, going by numerous online names like Captain Obvious, Tyler the Conqueror, and Hot Guy 160112, posing as a teenage boy interested in skateboarding. He asked his prey to video chat, then strip and perform a series of specific poses, all the while secretly recording them. One of Chancellor's targets, Ashley Reynolds, says she felt like his captor.
And as I'm doing this, he would be like, "No, this isn't right. This one's blurry, or you didn't do this right. You weren't doing it right. You got to do it again." So, and that's where being a slave to him comes in, because I had to make sure I complied.
Chancellor amassed more than 80,000 images and videos that he used to threaten the girls, saying he would hurt them or their families if they didn't give him more. He meticulously labeled his files, marking them done when he was satisfied with his blackmailing.
Next to the victim's name, he'd have little notes to himself, like I remember one was, "We'll try again." Another was, he had a note, "On Facebook now."
Samantha Chonsky was just 13 years old when she and a friend encountered Chancellor online.
He was in one of our chat rooms while me and my friend were chatting with people we thought were our age, asked us to flash our breasts, and for 2 seconds he was able to snap a picture.
Months later, he resurfaced, ready to manipulate her.
I couldn't believe that someone even had a picture of me, and I was afraid. I was super scared. And as a 13-year-old, you believe that someone's going to do those things that they said they're going to do to you.
Samantha says over the course of the next several hours, Chancellor directed her through his choreographed poses, asking her to perform graphic sex acts she'd never even heard of. Finally, Chancellor seemed satisfied and left Samantha alone. She says she immediately deleted her social media accounts and never told anyone about the encounter.
I was afraid every day that he would come back and taunt me.
Chancellor told the FBI he specifically sought out girls in their early teens.
One of the comments he made was because older girls wouldn't fall for his ploy.
Chancellor used multiple proxy servers that hid his identity, routing his communications through other countries. That's how some sextortionists get away with it, according to attorney Carrie Goldberg.
Local law enforcers don't know what to do. They don't know how to de-anonymize somebody who's acting out on the internet. They don't want to prosecute or worry about offenders who might be on the other side of the world, which which happens with these types of internet crimes.
Chancellor was finally prosecuted in 2014 and sentenced to 105 years in federal prison. But the FBI says only about a third of his victims have been identified, and they're encouraging more to come forward. Samantha Chonsky says she's glad to see him put away.
It was really overwhelming at first, but it felt really good to kind of confront the guy who caused me so much pain and suffering.
Chonsky says even though she knows she's safe from Chancellor, the experience has left her changed forever.
I became suicidal. I've attempted suicide. And I live with anxiety now. I can't walk down the street and feel comfortable if I get looked at by a strange man.
How concerned are you about sextortion?
I think that there couldn't be anything more important for our country to be focusing on as a new crime that needs to be really concentrated upon.
What is sextortion?
The FBI posted this video on their website, counseling teens how to protect themselves.
Here are some things you can do to avoid becoming a victim.
Because they're not alone, Samantha says she wants other girls to know they shouldn't feel embarrassed if they fall for a sextortion scam.
The best thing that you can do is to reach out to somebody that you know cares about you and is close to you and that you can trust and seek help.
For Nightline, I'm Lindsay Davis in New York.
All right, guys, so the last thing we're going to talk about is the parent's role, and this is the very last thing. And this is a really important kind of thing in this issue because for people of my generation and younger even, it's hard to imagine that young people, mostly women, girls, not always, mostly, would put themselves in this position. Right? It really is something that it's nothing that was part of our growing up, and even our having children of our own that we had to think about to any extent and fear for in real terms. But parents and who have young teenage girls now, and boys, but girls mostly, you have to keep in mind. They have to keep in mind that they really are victims, and likewise they're victims of people who are going to take advantage of them, and they're victims of themselves. Because again, the internet becomes such an important world in which they exist. So parents have to understand that there are predators out there, and the predators do groom their victims and encourage sexual exchanges, which are not by a great stretch of the imagination, an uncommon kind of thing, right? You would hope they would be, but they're not. Especially if you think if the victims are doing it with somebody who they know and who they feel is friendly, just to some degree, right? And so they're easily targeted. They're targeted individually. They're targeted on social media, right? And social media is a great resource for predators because they can, when they go to it, in a very short period of time, they can really see what vulnerabilities these possible victims have, and they can play into those vulnerabilities to work up a relationship, right? And then when that relationship is in place, that's when it can become abusive, right? And it's also important to remember that these kind of relationships with young people, they can progress very quickly, or they can develop over a long period of time. And parents have to keep all this in mind, because the last thing that people who are victims of this kind of thing need is to be judged, right? If they already have a sense of selflessness, less self-worth. They already have that. The self-blame, we talked about that earlier. They already have that because of what's happening to them. The last thing they need to have happen is, their family around them turning on them because they're shocked at what's happened, or they're disappointed in them because what's happened. So anyway, keep that in mind. So that's pretty much it. Any other comments on what we've talked about tonight before we go to the breakout sessions? Okay, all right, so again, as in last day, there are 5 questions that I posted on Moodle, and so I'm going to break you into 5 groups. The questions are pretty straightforward. Most of them only ask for 1 or 2 or 3 examples in the textbook, so it shouldn't take a long time to get to them. So I'm only going to do the breakout sessions for 15 minutes tonight. I think that should give everybody, each group, enough time to prepare their presentation. So you're going to go into the groups in a few minutes, and then I'll see you in 15. What you doing? Nothing. Nothing. Waiting for you. Okay. Almost done. I'll be done by 10 after. Yeah, I'm really tired. I know. I went walking and shopping. Hmm? I went walking and shopping. Where'd you go walking? Huh? Did you? Wow, good for you. Didn't take me with you. Bring the class with you.